The only suggestion I can make is that the teller of supernatural tales should be well frightened in the telling. For if he is, he may perhaps communicate to his readers a sense of that strange something undreamt of in the philosophy of Horatio. This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 8, and we are beginning a new series on ghosts. The introduction was from Edith Wharton. It was from her preface to the Ghost Stories of Edith Wharton. And one of the things about this time of year, we are recording this November 19th, is that I think it's a really, really good time to start talking about ghosts for a couple of reasons. Number one, down here where I live, the weather just started to turn cold, finally. And so it's a time to get kind of cozy and start to share those ghost stories. But also, and as we've talked about before, on this podcast, we've talked about ghost stories and haunted houses, and we've talked a little bit about the Christmas ghost story. So this definitely has a tradition in the winter season. But also because I am just really reluctant to give up Halloween. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I'm definitely one of those people that when Halloween is over and everybody starts to put away all the spooky things, and they start playing Christmas music before Thanksgiving, I start getting really irritated. So this is my way to kind of counteract that by talking about ghosts. So I'm excited. As we jump into this series, we're going to start the way we start a lot of our episode series. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of not ghosts in particular, but really ghost stories. And we're going to try to steer away from haunted houses since we've already done a little bit of that in previous episodes. So just in giving the history of this, I find it really fascinating, the ghosts that appear in the stories that we tell. Because, and of course, as a student of literature and as a teacher of literature, ghosts have hung around since we've been telling stories. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, to Homer's work, on through Shakespeare, and ghosts have always been there. But one thing that I find really fascinating is how we've changed our perception of ghosts. Because when I think about, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh or Homer, just those are some of the earliest ones that I can think of. The ghosts really tend to be keepers of knowledge, but they also exist in a completely different world than we do as humans. So they're usually humans who have passed away, and now they are residing in the underworld. And so what ends up happening in these stories is that the hero has to venture down into the underworld in order to obtain some sort of knowledge that the deceased person has taken with them, or that the person now has because they're living in a different realm. But it's much less of a haunting the way we have ghost stories today, where those worlds kind of sit on top of each other, for lack of a better word. But it does start to change a little bit, because then by the time you get into Shakespeare, they become more of a warning. The ghosts are kind of lingering there to tell you. I mean, we already mentioned Dickens or the Christmas ghost story, and of course, a lot of people would think of Dickens and A Christmas Carol, which we have talked about in a previous episode. I highly recommend you go back and listen to that one if you haven't already, because it's a really good one. But even in that one, the ghosts are there to kind of guide the hero on the journey, to warn them of a life that may happen or of something coming. That's still really kind of different from a lot of the ghost stories that we hear today. So that's kind of one of the things I'm wanting to explore a little bit with this, is what exactly are we talking about when we talk about ghosts in these stories? Um, and what is it, as always in this podcast, we try to answer this question, but what is it that scares us about it? Now, Mel, I know you suggested this topic, so I want to give you a chance to kind of talk a little bit about that. Um, but I don't know. Tell me about ghosts.
I love getting asked that question because anyone who knows me knows that I've done a lot of writing and thinking about ghosts. I've had colleagues jokingly call me a ghostologist, so I've probably thought about ghosts way too much. I mean,
Please tell me you have that plaque on your door that just says, Dr. Mel, ghostologist.
I don't. Maybe you could make me one for Christmas. Because I would totally put it up on my door. I do have a shirt that says Department of Hauntology on it. Is that, but not ghostologist.
That's close enough.
There we go. But yeah, I liked a lot of what you were saying there. I mean, I think it was pretty much kind of the history of ghosts in a nutshell or a kernel. I mean, just like you said, we can go back to the first stories that people told, and they had some sort of ghost in them, probably because we were creeped out about what happens to you after you die, as we obviously still are. We really just don't know. And then I was actually doing a little bit of reading just for myself this past week, but it also had to do with ghosts. And I was reminded of how apparently, I believe it was during medieval times, people believed that if a murderer was forced to touch a victim's wounds, that they would bleed again, so that, you'd be like, oh, that person obviously killed this person, or ghosts would pursue the guilty, which I guess kind of goes to some of Shakespeare's ghosts that show up to show that someone's guilty or torment someone with a guilty conscience. And then, of course, you also have, I think we talked about this before, spectral evidence that was used like during the witchcraft trials, like Salem, and in Europe in the 17th century. This idea that you could say that someone appeared to you in a ghostly form and tormented you, and judges would not take it with 100% certainty. People did argue about whether it was something that should be accepted, but some courts did accept that. So you have this idea of like ghosts often get muddled into people's religion or spirituality, or they stand in contrast to it, and they get muddled into sometimes our ideas of law and justice, or they stand against the rational. One of the reasons I chose the Edith Wharton quote is because she talks about how you have to convince the reader that it's something undreamt of in the philosophy of Horatio. And in Hamlet, you have that idea of like the rational ghost can't be real versus the person seeing a ghost. And why? Is it real? Is it just a figment of some aspect of that person's personality? It's kind of unclear. It's, like most stories, ambiguous, however you want to interpret it. So, one of the things I've always thought was interesting is how we kind of go back and forth, just like you said, Lisa, throughout time, wondering what ghosts are. We either think it's like balderdash and it's superstition, or, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, scientists were trying to figure out what ghosts were with the psychical societies. And you also have writers writing different sorts of ghost stories. I mean, we still have ghost stories today in the 21st century. They just sometimes may be more unconventional or different than we normally think that they would be. I mean, a book just came out, edited by Ellen Datlow, of a collection of ghost stories, the Saga Anthology of Ghost Stories. I'm reading through it right now. I recommend it. But ghost stories haven't necessarily gone away. They just get picked up by different people for different purposes. And, one of the things that, well, Lisa, you and I have talked about coming off of our book Monster She Wrote, is why women were writing ghost stories. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll talk about obviously in this episode, but from just like questions about what happens after you die, but also that ghosts can be really interesting metaphors for things that women and sometimes other marginalized groups might be experiencing. So yeah, I think one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to go back and talk about ghosts, just ghosts, and not necessarily haunted houses per se, is because it's such a flexible and kind of fertile horror trope. Like the werewolf that keeps coming back in different forms, or the vampire, or the zombie, like ghosts are never going to go away. Even though Edith Wharton said once you get electricity and the moving pictures and technology, ghosts will eventually go away because there's no hidden place for them to be. They're still around because there's still things we don't understand. There's still places we don't understand. We don't even understand ourselves, so ghosts end up being that kind of way to get a peek at our psychology or who we are or what we're haunted by. Not just like supernatural stuff. It's just kind of a way to look at the things that bother us or haunt us or scare us. Oh no, I mean, that was kind of like the tiniest historical review of ghosts ever. Did that help?
Yeah, it did. And one of the things I really find fascinating was, number one, I just kind of have to laugh because when you were talking about, ghosts being used as almost a method of revenge, if somebody had been killed or, to help. I mean, there's all sorts of stories about this ghost helped find the murderer, like it's part of the Scooby-Doo gang or something. But I always find it fascinating is what happens in the afterlife that makes all of these ghosts like suddenly very reliable. Because the ones who have messages for, I mean, in the stories, at least, like people they're like, yeah, I mean, if I can just talk to this ghost, I'll get the truth. And it's like, that was one thing that I always found interesting about these ghost stories is why are we suddenly trusting this person? I mean, I guess we're to assume that because they're in their ghostly form, they have no reason to lie about earthly matters anymore. I don't know.
If I was a ghost, I'd totally mess with them.
I was thinking the same thing.
I mean, because come on, right? Like if you're greedy, like heirs, to hold a seance to try to talk to you to find out where you buried your gold or something. I mean, yeah, I'm messing with them, right?
Well, I mean, Hamlet even says, like, is this really my dad, or is it a demon coming back to mess me up or make me kill someone and then I go to hell? So, I mean, I do think sometimes people do wonder, but you're right. Most of the time people are just like, come give us this information and we'll totally believe you because you're a specter now. Therefore, you must be trustworthy. And that also goes to like when the ghost story was developing in the 19th century, you also had other genres developing, like the detective story. And I think it might be influenced by that. Not necessarily the ghost honesty, but like ghost stories are backwards mysteries. Like a detective looks for the clues to solve a death, whereas in ghost stories, you got to be haunted to solve it. So it's like two different ways of knowing. So I don't know. Maybe it's just a plot device that you got to trust the ghost. That's a good question. I need to go look up, ghosts that play around with people and don't tell the truth.
Well, if you go with the convention that that ghosts exist because they have unfinished business, which I'm not going to say is 100% true or not, but if you're using that convention, then I guess you would have reason to trust them because they want that unfinished business finished so they can move on. But if that's not the convention that you're using, I totally agree with you. Like why would my ghost want to help my greedy heirs find anything? Like wild goose chase from beyond the grave would be really fun.
It'd be entertaining.
Well, yeah.
I mean, you can't have too much to do.
I mean, depictions of the afterlife seem rather boring. Whether you're talking about kind of the underworld of Greek mythology, where I don't know, they always just kind of struck me as these like shadow people hanging around. Even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, by the time they get to, I'm going to butcher his name, but Tanapishtim. The Noah character in that story. By the time they get to him to ask how do you get immortality? I guess he's not technically a ghost. He's an ever living being, but he's kind of like just given up. He's just so bored with everything that he's just like, whatever. Yeah, I would think there'd be a lot more hijinks going on. But like you said, Matt, that goes against the idea that ghosts who are hanging around have some sort of unfinished business, which seems to be one of the most popular tropes that go along with the ghost story. Either that or somebody who tragically died too young. That seems to be another one. Because rarely are houses or any place really haunted by, grandma or grandpa who passed away at like 96 in their sleep. It's always, there was a young bride, and on her wedding night, the happiest night of her life, she fell down the stairs, tripping on her beautiful dress that she couldn't wait to wear, and then broke her neck and died. Like those are always the stories that you hear when you hear about a haunted place, when you go somewhere and people get that like wide-eyed look and they're like, oh, I have to tell you the story that this place is haunted, because that's what people want to do. I found that when we were in, I don't even remember what town we were in. It was one of these southern towns. It might have been like Charleston or Savannah or someplace like that. And we sat down in a restaurant, and the first thing the waitress says is, "Did you know this place is haunted?" That's something people just want to say to you, and they all want to tell you this story. And it is always something like overly tragic the story that they want to tell you. Right. And I think that's when we drill down to the heart of these ghosts. And I think, we've kind of like talked around this, but it's never really about the story itself, right? It's about that person that we focus on in who we make the ghost in the story. I think that's what's really fascinating for me to look at.
Well, it's interesting that I agree. A lot of the stories tend to focus on the tragic life cut short, or the person who was murdered, the murder victim, those sorts of things. Do either of you listen to the podcast Reply All?
No, I haven't.
No, tell me about it.
Okay, well, I mean, it's not in any way connected to horror generally, but it's a fantastic podcast. It's always one of those ones that gets like recommended to people if they've never really listened to podcasts. It's produced by Gimlet, and there's two hosts, and they explore all sorts of different stuff on the internet. But the reason I bring it up is they had a very recent Halloween themed episode where they invited listeners to share some of their like weird paranormal experiences. And I was behind in my podcast listening, so I wasn't actually listening to this episode until actually just this past weekend, which is mid-November for those of you who are not us and know exactly when we're recording this. But one of the things I was struck by was a couple of the ones that they picked were like these paranormal experiences where it was very clearly centered around a dead relative, but not in any sort of like bad haunting way. One was a girl talking about her boyfriend's house being haunted, and they thought that the ghost was his grandfather, just sort of essentially like checking in, letting them know that everything's all right. And another one was about someone's dad who had passed away, again just sort of like reassuring them. And as I listened to them, I was kind of struck, because I was thought, when we tell these creepy stories about the paranormal and ghosts in particular, that's not usually our go-to. And I mean, I was already thinking ahead for this episode while I was listening to it. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that like, when we think of the ghost story, that's what we think of as the life cut short, when in fact, if you believe in ghosts, they can be all ages and for all reasons. It's not all hauntings are necessarily bad ones. And I myself had kind of forgotten that until I was listening to that episode of Reply All.
Yeah, a lot of this ghost stories that people tell, not like because they're trying to get more people in their restaurant or they want to make a ghost tour, are these kind of like my loved one came to me and I know they're okay now, or I saw my grandmother sitting in her favorite chair. And this is actually, it's funny, I'd read this a while back when I was doing research for something else, but I just stumbled upon a note for this in the past couple of weeks when I was thinking about ghosts. Is when the British Psychical Society wanted to investigate ghosts, they just sent out a call for anybody in newspapers. They said, hey, if you experience a ghost or a haunting, or you have a ghost story, tell us, send it to us. The vast majority of the responses they got were what they called crisis apparitions, where somebody would wake up in the middle of the night and their mom would be standing over them. and it turned out that their mom had passed away like right at that moment, or they're like on another continent and their best friend appears next to them on the train they're riding on or something. It turns out their best friend like died at that moment, or they were experiencing something really bad. And so it just seemed like a lot of people were like, if there was somebody they were super close to, they felt like when they looked back, they were like, oh, I saw that person when they died. Like they'd be like, oh, I got a telegram like 2 weeks later or whatever, but then I realized I saw them. And, you know, one of the things that Nora Sedgwick, the investigator that was working on the case, said is, I don't know if ghosts are real, but we have to investigate why people keep claiming they see these things, because people apparently believe it. And so, yeah, I mean, you get a mix of like these kind of, somebody died and I think I saw them because it was this traumatic thing, and we have this kind of tight connection, telepathic connection, or whatever. So maybe they're saying goodbye, or you just have them checking up on you, versus, yeah, the tragic life cut short. And that was also what caused the problem of ghost clothes, which became a big issue for investigators, because they were like, if you're dead and you're a ghost, why would you be wearing clothing when you come back? So there were all sorts of crazy theories about ectoplasmic clothing and what style you would pick as a ghost, and whether people were imagining clothes on you because they don't want to see you any other way, or people making this up because that's why the ghosts have clothes. It was like a big thing that they actually worried about. And they spent time on. But yeah, it seems like people are haunted by things that are scary or traumatic, or they're just haunted because it's grief. They lost somebody that was really important to them.
The thing about the ghost clothes really kind of cracks me up, and that makes me laugh.
I mean, what would the fashion be like in the afterlife? Would you just wear whatever you wanted? I don't know.
Well, you know, and I don't want to show my hand too quickly in this episode's series, and kind of my theories on ghosts or whatever. But one thing that has always bugged me, because I'm sure we'll talk about, you know, these ghost hunting shows at some point, which were really, really popular for a while, and it seemed like, you know, there was a new one popping up every week. And the thing that always bugged me about that is a lot of these stories were when they would focus in on like what the ghost was wearing, right? And it was always, and it's kind of a joke now, but you know, I saw a woman in a Victorian dress. And I want to be like, what? Why? Like, why are they always Victorian? You know, like let's pick a different era here. Why can't you see somebody wearing like bell bottoms from the 70s? You know, but I guess you don't, or somebody who looks closer to us. You know, why are those the ones that are hanging around? And then also when they would do some of these international hunts, it always bothered me when they'd be like some, I don't know, you know, haunted abbey in Italy or something, and they'd be speaking English to the ghosts. And I was just, in that kind of thing would always it was those kind of details that would hang me up, kind of like the ghost clothes, which would be like, if you're speaking to a ghost, presumably who died in Italy and lived in Italy, don't you need to be speaking Italian? I don't know.
Universal translator for ghosts.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess that's what happens to you in the afterlife, is you not only know the answer to all questions, but you automatically are handed Victorian dress and a universal translator, and that's how it all works.
That was one of my favorite things about The Sixth Sense, was that one of the ghosts was clearly like a kid from the 70s, like in his bell bottoms and stuff. Like, I liked that they weren't all just like pioneer days people.
Yeah, I keep seeing this weird kid in suspenders and a bowler hat, and I don't know what that's about.
Well, Victorians seem to have gotten a bad rap when it comes to haunting anyway. Like, Victorian houses are always haunted, and everybody talks about Victorian ghost stories. I guess Victorian people are the only people who haunt you, and it's just a running theme.
Yeah. You know, I want to circle back to something Matt said, because when you were talking about that podcast, Matt, and I have no research into this, but I would love it if somebody did research this, because I have a feeling the types of ghost stories that we tell as in like that restaurant story. When I sat down and the woman told me this whole involved story that I can't remember now about how, it was prohibition and there were cops and somebody died, and it was also a brothel at one point, and there were dead prostitutes all over the place. Those are the kind of stories that circulate around the South a whole lot, with hauntings. Unless it's a story that's being circulated like a folklore tale or like an urban legend, those tend to be very sensationalist stories. They involve somebody who did die tragically enough. But it's interesting that if you ask somebody, have you ever had a personal experience with ghosts? I bet the majority of those stories would be something about loss and grief. Seeing somebody who they loved who had passed on. And I kind of think that's the way when you ask somebody, like, do you know a good ghost story? They're probably going to tell you one of the kind of urban legend ones. Like, oh yeah, I was once touring this, old house and they told me this really cool story. But then if you say, have you ever seen a ghost, or do you have any personal experience with a ghost, you're probably going to get the loss of a loved one, which I find really, really interesting. And it does kind of show the diversity of these stories. I want to share kind of to that end. Mel, I know you and I have talked about this book a lot, but Colin Dickey wrote a book called Ghostland: An American History and Haunted Places, which I highly, highly recommend. It follows a lot of these kind of haunted places in America. So he talks about like Salem and that sort of thing. There's a few in like Los Angeles and some of these famously haunted places, but he doesn't really involve himself as much in the theatrics of the story, but he tries to dig down to why we keep circulating these same stories. So kind of what we're doing here, but he had early on this really neat passage that it kind of goes, Matt, with what you were talking about. And he wrote, and this is a quote from his book, ghosts bridge the past to the present. They speak across the seemingly insurmountable barriers of death and time, connecting us to what we thought was loss. They give us hope for a life beyond death, and because of this, help us to cope with loss and grief. Their presence is the promise that we don't have to say goodbye to our loved ones right away, and that what was left undone in one's life might yet be finished by one's ghost. And I thought that was a really lovely way of explaining why we have these kind of personal haunting stories, or even some of these stories of the ghost with the unfinished business, because it makes us feel better. It makes us feel better that we never really did say goodbye, that there's always going to be more after that. But also, if we don't finish everything we want to, or if we have things that are left unsaid, we can still kind of rectify that, which that I think is one of the more positive reasons I think we have for telling these ghost stories.
Yeah, I agree. And unfortunately is the wrong word to use, but while you were talking about that, all of a sudden I remembered in the Netflix Haunting of Hill House, our favorite character, Steve, the woman says, why would I want to see my ghost husband in this horrible position? Why do I keep seeing this over and over again? And he said, it's better than never seeing him again. And I think there is this idea that a ghost is a memory or a ghost is a wish. It's for the thing that you may not be able to have more time. Yeah, it's that connection that we all want.
Yeah, but that's not all the ghost stories we tell. Like I said, that's kind of the sweet side of the ghost stories we tell. But I think there are much more sinister stories that we tell too. And I wonder if there is also benefit to those stories, because let's face it, a lot of, especially as we get into the 20th century, you mentioned, Mel, ghosts really were popular in the 19th century, and a lot of them were going, they were helping detectives solve their crimes, and they were pretty active in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, ghosts became, or had a tendency to become, much more violent, because we also have story. I mean, when we really get down to why ghosts scare us, because if they're all just grandmother coming to sit in her old chair and kind of smile at us, ghosts don't seem so bad. But there is something that's absolutely terrifying about that. And I don't think it's merely just the specter of death, just this reminder that that's what's coming for us. I mean, I think that's part of it. But, we also kind of have to address the idea of a vengeful ghost or just a plain violent ghost.
Oh, yeah. You're thinking like the idea maybe of a poltergeist, perhaps, just unbridled violence for almost no reason.
Sure. I mean, and I know we talked about this in the haunted house episode, but when I think about like a really super scary ghost, my mind immediately goes to Toni Morrison's Beloved, because that is a ghost that I don't want to be anywhere near.
Oh, yeah. And it's a ghost that means so many different things to so many people. I mean, it can mean a family connection. It also can mean, a horrific trauma that you're trying to repress at the same time you can't stop remembering. One thing that popped into my mind while you were talking about vengeful ghosts too is the M.R. James story that you and I did for last Christmas. It was called Something Hearts, where the man was doing experiments on the children, and they come back and like rip his heart out.
Yes,
that's some real vengeance. Was it Two Hearts? Was that what it was?
Lost Hearts.
Lost Hearts.
Was it Lost Hearts?
I think you might be right. I mean, that's some intense stuff right there. Of course, they're specifically coming for one person. Of course, M.R. James's ghosts were really interesting. I mean, some people talk about how Shirley Jackson made ghosts scarier because they were psychological and you could be haunted like by yourself, and that's disturbing and terrifying. But M.R. James, who listeners Lisa and I talked about on our last Christmas episode, an aficionado of Christmas ghost stories. This ghost stories didn't always take place at Christmas, but he would tell them at Christmas. His ghosts were crazy, weird, and terrifying. I mean, I recommend going back and checking them out this Christmas if you've never read an M.R. James ghost story. Sometimes the stories can be kind of formulaic. And I guess as an academic, I have a soft spot for him because it's often academics and professors like finding forbidden knowledge and being too curious. But his ghosts are not just like wafy little spectral things that are like go through you. They like rip your chest open and pull your heart out with claws. They're little frog-like things like covered with hair that grab onto you and put their arms around your neck and follow you and like hang on to you or try to strangle you. They're creepy spidery things that slide down your curtains and fall on your bed and smother you. I mean, they are embodied, gross, violent, disturbing things. And when you read the stories, he builds up in such a way, or he gives you these little bits of information about these things that are sliding and slithering and crawling around. That is just, it's just thinking about some of his quote unquote ghosts are really interesting. Cause I think we typically think of a ghost as, like you were saying, Lisa, like the gray lady in the Victorian dress who went right through me and made me cold. But his ghosts are like, they're just angry, pissed off, vengeful, kind of violent.
Well, that, in that case, it sounds more like what we would connect to like a demon. Like I thought of that immediately when you said, the professor who now possesses some sort of forbidden knowledge. I mean, that's, that's what like Evil Dead was built off of, accidentally, coming across something you shouldn't know about, but also that, and again, we're talking a lot in the American and British tradition because that's, I think, what we are most well read in. But when you go into other cultures, especially like the Japanese culture and stuff, I think the ghosts do tend to be more of that monstrous, vengeful, spiteful. And they're not just going after whoever like did that to them. It may be a murder victim, who's, or a suicide. They do a lot with suicides. But, it may be somebody who's like, okay, I'm coming back to take vengeance on what happened to me because it was wrong. But they're going to keep doing that. They don't just target one person, as in that M.R. James story, Lost Hearts, which it's funny because I had blocked that story out of my head until you said it again. I guess I had just like pushed it so far back there. I was like, I don't need to access that anymore. That was
It
terrifying.
is creepy. Well, and
It is creepy.
I'm not an expert on Japanese ghosts. I've only watched a couple movies. Well, one I watched with you, Lisa, back when we were grad students. But that also is not just fully embodied, which I think is really disturbing from anybody's perspective. And Morrison does that with Beloved too. If you have a violent, vengeful ghost, nothing does that better than something that can grab you, or you can grab them. Very human. But those ghosts are also kind of like grotesque, right? Or twisted, or walk creepily toward. There's something about them that's uncanny and not quite right, that they don't even have to be doing much, and you just get the creepy crawlies. And yeah, they're after anybody. They're just mad, undifferentiated violence.
Which is really interesting, because when you talk about the shivers and the creepy crawlies, that is one of the emotions we associate with ghost stories, because ghost stories very rarely run into that kind of horror, where you're just terrified. I'm relying on that term from like the Anne Radcliffe definition. It's more akin to terror, where it just kind of awakens your senses rather than annihilates them. So it does give you that creepy crawly or the tingly sensation. When you think about ghosts, you kind of shudder, right? That's something we talk about, where you shiver, you shudder. But it is interesting, because ghosts in and of themselves, they're scary if they look wrong. As you said, they're kind of walking all funny, and something just, they don't look human anymore, and that's terrifying, because they were once human, but they're not. They're now something different. They've changed, and I guess that goes along with the fear too, that could be us one day as well. And it goes all the way back to kind of fears of the afterlife and the unknown, and what's going to happen following death. But even if you do have that nice Victorian lady, you said, who just gives you shivers, or you just experience as a cold spot, you think about a lot of those stories, and where the fear comes in that is, often somebody would be like, well, I spent all afternoon talking to this very lovely young woman. And then somebody says, what are you talking about? You were alone in the room the whole time. And it's that kind of now cliched revelation of, it was a ghost the whole time. It kind of, Matt, goes back to what you were talking about with The Sixth Sense, right? Of the idea that is what is scary too, is that what if they appear too real? Like, what if then we can't trust ourselves anymore? So it's weird that they run the spectrum of that, where they're either, we know it's a ghost, we know it's something supernatural, or, we may just think they're a real human, because in that case, how many ghosts have we interacted with and we just don't know?
Oh, that's really creepy. Now I have to think about that. Well, and that's also the other scary thing about ghosts, is a lot of times when we think about them, we think, oh, in order to see one or experience one, you need to be haunted. But like you were saying, you could experience a ghost that's just violent toward anybody. Or yeah, you could just like go, like Edith Wharton's story about Miss Mary Pass, like, I'm going to go visit this woman. Oh crap, she was dead the whole time. I mean, like, you don't even know you're being haunted while you're being haunted, which is kind of, it's an interesting take, I think. And it also, I guess in a way, it plays on this idea of like, do we ever really go away? Like, are we literally just layered onto the earth with dead people, and like past is never past, as William Faulkner said, and it's always kind of playing out, and we just stumble into these weird pockets of trauma and loss and then bump out of them. I mean, in some ways it's uniquely human, and in other ways it's just kind of this terrifying reaction to how scary our lives really are, I guess, to a certain extent.
One thing that I find really fascinating about all this, and I mean, it's funny. Ghosts are one of those things, and this just kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about. But ghosts are one of those things that when I was younger, I was terrified of them. Ghosts and vampires, for some reason. Those were the two that just really got me. But not vampires as much, because I understood they couldn't come in unless you invited them in. but I was convinced they were constantly circling my house, just waiting for somebody to invite them in when I was really young. But ghosts used to bother me, and I remember staying at friends' houses, and several of my friends lived in these really old houses that were, I mean, we're talking, Civil War era houses. They've been around since then, and or even short, or maybe shortly after the Civil War. And so they came with a lot of history. And those were always the scariest to me, because I think as a kid, I had this sense of, here is this building or this place that has existed for so much longer than I've been alive. And so many people have kind of passed in and out of it. And I think that was one of the things that really kind of scared me about it, was this, because when you talk about ghosts and you talk about spectrality, you really have to talk about the concept of time too. And we've already talked about it as far as it's personal to us, because we all know intellectually that our time is going to run out at some point. Like at some point, that is just inevitable, that we're going to reach the end of our life. And ghosts are there to kind of remind us of that, which is not always pleasant to think about. But it's also the concept of time too, to think about, right now I have my life, I have everything going on, and things feel really hectic. And, I've got 2 kids who keep me busy, and I've got a career, and, a husband and 2 dogs, and I've got this house that I'm worried about, and, you're just worried about all these things. But then when you're thinking about ghost and time, and I hope this makes sense, it forces you to think about history. And it forces, I don't know, at least for me, that was one of the things that always bothered me about these haunted places, is because usually they were very old places, whether they were old homes or old restaurants or whatever. They were very old places. And it made me feel very small and very insignificant on that timeline. And I didn't always like that feeling. Does that make sense when you think about like spectrality and time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's kind of almost like an existential dread there too,
Exactly. That's the phrase I was looking for, and my brain was not throwing it up. Existential dread is exactly what. Yeah,
it's its own type of anxiety. I
it is.
find myself thinking that when I'm touring historical places too, because I think that when I'm in an older house, I totally get what you're saying. But also, like if I'm touring a place like I can't remember where I was now over the summer, but I was taking a tour of this house, and we were looking at all the pictures of the people who lived in it before, and this person did this, and this person did this, and then this person died, and then this person came in, and they did this, and then they died. And there's this whole like mosaic of things that have happened. Like if you take any spot anywhere in the world, there are wars and people building houses and time. I mean, the amount of time and the things that have happened in one spot. I think it's overwhelming when you think about it from the perspective of a person who may live in their 80s, their 90s bonus, or may not even live that long. That we're very egocentric and we like to think about ourselves, but there's all this history pressing down upon us that I think could be very disturbing, and we don't have ways to intellectually deal with that. So maybe ghost stories come out of that too. It's like there's history that we look up and history stories that we like to tell, but there's also that existential idea that, well, someday 50 to 100 years from now, something else will be here where my house is, that there's this whole string of time and you can't slow it down, and you're only in a tiny part of it. And it's also perspective too. I mean, perspective for a ghost would just be completely unmoored from time itself. It's very heavy, and it's kind of mind bending. And yeah, I think existential dread is the only way to describe it.
I was just going to say, you're making me very uncomfortable. It's like looking out at the stars and thinking about the smallness of your own place in this universe. Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to sleep tonight.
Yeah. On that note, let's go to bed.
Welcome to Lisa's brain.
Well, I've had those same sort of thoughts, and especially when I was in high school. My family, we took a trip to England for like a week and a half, and I remember like touring the Tower of London and some of these other historical sites. There was we took a day trip out to a place where there were like these Roman baths, like from the time of Rome, and it was even at my age, I think I was about 14 or maybe 15. Like even at that age, I was able to kind of pull myself out of my egocentric teenagerness and was kind of marveled at the awe of like, wow, these were things that were built thousands of years ago in some cases, definitely like many hundreds of years ago, and the sheer number of people that have passed through and seen these sites, stood where I've stood, all that. Yeah, does make you feel very small in the grand scheme of things.
It does. And this may be because I don't want to leave our listeners with existential dread to carry around until our next episode.
We're a horror podcast. Why not?
That's our job.
The end. Be uncomfortable, guys.
In the end. One of the things that I found also in Dickey's Ghostland book, which again I just love, is when he talks about, like, basically he tries to drill down to why we tell the stories that we tell, the ghost stories that we tell. And one of the things he brings up is that, history, Mel, like you said, if you go visit any place, you're going to see this really rich layered mosaic of different people and different lives. And like you look at a house and think, even the house I live in now, we're the second family to live in here, but you can still point out like, oh, well, the first family did this, and then we came in and changed this, so there's that sense of that layered history. But when we talk about broader history, and this is a common phrase that you'll hear people think, is that history is written by who? History is written by the victors. History is written by the people who came in and conquered. And usually they are white males in the case of most of the world. Those are the people writing the history. And Mel, you kind of posed this question, and I'm not going to quite fully answer it because I hope we have a full discussion on a later episode of this. But ghost stories form a neat bridge in that history that we tell. Because what they do is they either tell the personal history of somebody, which kind of serves to be a story that says, you know what, I lived, I existed, I was here, I made my mark. Like, you can't just make me small. You're going to have to tell my story. So it serves to be kind of that personal story, but it also serves to be a history of the people who aren't getting to tell the quote unquote real history. And I think that's why a lot of the ghost stories involve, for instance, women, a woman who died in childbirth, or a woman who, was killed, under the hands of an abusive man. Or in some cases, in a lot of, especially around here in the South, there's a lot of stories about African-American slaves. If you go to almost any plantation, if you go on a plantation tour, they're going to tell you usually the quote unquote true history of, so-and-so lived here, so-and-so built this house, so-and-so, but then they're going to tell you the side story of, and we have a ghost story about this person. And so those stories serve as a way to fill in the gaps of history that we're not telling. And so that's kind of, I don't know if that's more hopeful or not, but it ends up being kind of a fight against that existential dread. That's why I can never think of the word, because I can never say the word properly. It serves as kind of a pushback to that, because if we feel small and insignificant in history, well, we can still tell stories of these small personal people who maybe didn't go on to do anything quote unquote great or history making, but we're still going to tell their stories anyway. So on that note, hopefully that will serve as a as a little teaser to come back as we finish this episode, because I think there's going to be a lot with ghosts for us to talk about. And I hope that you guys will certainly come back and join us for that. This is just a reminder that your co-hosts Lisa and Mel wrote a nonfiction book about the women who have written horror and dark speculative fiction titled Monster She Wrote. You can get your copy by going to the Quirk Books website or any major book retailer. And this is really exciting. So if you're listening to this as it comes out in November with the holidays coming up, our publisher Quirk has a holiday pop-up shop online through December 16th. And you can go and purchase any of their books, and that includes Monster She Wrote. But it comes in a nice gift-wrapped box that comes with a copy of the book, a bookmark, a pen, a super cool ink pen that's shaped like a bone, and a few other fun goodies. We will have a link in the show notes for that. But as you've listened to this, I hope you've maybe been talking back to us and sharing some of your own ideas about ghosts. If you have some ideas, we would love to hear from you. So this is your invitation to reach out to us and share some of your own stories or your own thoughts about why we tell the ghost stories that we tell. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, you can do that by sending an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. And of course, if you just love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon, and you'll get access to exclusive content, including mini episodes in our off weeks. If you do not have the funds for that, we completely understand. We would love it, though, if you would consider rating and reviewing us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. As always, thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode on ghosts.